"Move that filthy old woman away from the gate. She is an eyesore, and I will not have my photographs ruined by a beggar." The gentleman said it loudly enough that the whole front of the crowd heard him, and he said it to the king's guard. The way a man speaks to a porter he means to tip badly. He had a hand on his cane and a hand pointed at me, and the finger was steady, because men like him have never once doubted that pointing settles a thing. My name does not matter, but my flowers do, so you may call me the flower woman of the Lion's Gate, which is what the children of the lane have called me for 31 years. I have sold posies and buttonholes and small bound bunches of stock and sweet pea from the same 3 slate flags at the corner of the railing since I was a young widow with 2 boys and a barrow that wanted a wheel. I was there before the gentleman was born. I will, with any luck and the kindness of the post, be there after he has forgotten he ever stood at it. But he did not know that, and he did not care to. He saw a bent woman in a gray shawl with a tin pail of water and a wooden tray, and he decided I was litter that had blown against the most beautiful gate in the kingdom, and that someone in a red tunic ought to sweep me up. The guard at the box that morning was the young one. I knew his face, though I had never heard his name spoken. I had watched him take the post through 3 winters, and I had learned to read the small weather of a guardsman's face the way a shepherd reads a hill. He stood at the foot of the Lion's Gate in the full kit, the long red wool tunic, the brass winking, the tall black bearskin pulled low, the white gloves laid one over the other on the rifle, the chinstrap cutting a pale line on a young man's jaw. He looked at nothing, which is the hardest looking there is. He had not moved when the gentleman raised his voice, and he did not move now. That was what undid the gentleman, I think. He had expected the red coat to leap. He had expected the machine of the place to obey him the instant he set it a task, because that is what places had always done for him. And the machine simply went on breathing in front of the gate, white-gloved and silent, with its eyes on the far side of the road, and would not be wounded. "Did you hear me?" the gentleman said. He took a step closer, and the brim of his fine gray hat came near enough to the guard's chin that I could have told you the price of the hat. "I said move her. She's been pestering my party for 10 minutes, hawking her weeds at gentlefolk like a gypsy. It is a disgrace to the crown that you let her squat here." I had not pestered anyone. I had sold 3 buttonholes and a bunch of stock to a kind couple from the country, and I had told a little girl the name of the blue flower because she asked, and I had said good morning to the post the way I say it every day, low, not expecting an answer, only wanting the man inside the stillness to know that someone had marked him kindly. That is the whole of what I had done. But the gentleman did not want the truth of the morning. He wanted a clean photograph and a world arranged to his liking, and I was in the way of both. The crowd had gone the particular quiet that crowds go when they smell a scene. Phones came up. I saw them rise along the railing like reeds turning to the wind, the little dark glass eyes all swinging to us, and I felt my old heart drop, because I have lived long enough to know that a thing put on those screens does not die when the moment does. It travels. It lands in rooms you will never see, in front of people who will decide who you are from 10 seconds of you on the worst morning of your year. "I'll have your number, soldier," the gentleman said, when the guard still had not answered. "I am a man of some standing in this city, and I know people who will be very interested to hear that the Lion's Gate is guarded by a man who cannot perform the simplest task. Move her on." He rapped the brass of his cane on the cobbles between each word, the way you would knock on a door behind which a servant was being slow. And the king's guard breathed and looked at the far railing and did not move. I want to be honest about myself here, because there is no use telling a story if you are going to come out of it clean. I was afraid. Not of the gentleman, I have been shouted at by better men than him, and worse, but of the morning turning. I have a pension that is a joke and a back that is a worse one, and the 3 slate flags at the Lion's Gate are not only where I make my few coins, they are where I am somebody. Down the lane I am old Meg with the bad hip. At the gate I am the flower woman, a fixture, a face the regiment knows, A woman the postman waved to and the constables called by name. Take me off the corner and I am nobody anywhere. I knew, watching the phones rise, that a man of standing who decides to move a beggar usually manages it, given a fortnight and a few telephone calls. I had seen it done to the chestnut seller 2 gates down, who had been there longer than me and was gone in a month and never came back. So I did the only thing my pride would let me. I bent, slow, to gather my pail and my tray, to spare the guard the trouble and to take myself out of the photograph before it was taken. "Leave it, missus." The voice came from along the railing, a workman in a high-visibility coat, with a paper cup of tea steaming in his fist. "You've every right to that corner. Don't you move for him." "That's old Meg," said a woman near him, to no one and to everyone. "She's been there donkey's years. My Nan bought her wedding flowers off her." "He can't just order her off," said a young lad with one of the phones. "She's not doing nothing." The gentleman turned on them with the cane, and that was his first mistake, though he would make a great many more before the morning was done. "This is precisely the trouble with this country now," he said, his voice climbing. "No standards. You let any vagrant set up shop on royal ground and you call it character. I pay more in a year than this entire lane sees in a decade, and I will not be lectured on rights by a man drinking tea out of a paper cup." That last landed badly. I saw it land. A crowd will forgive a great deal of temper, but it will not forgive a man for despising it out loud, and he had just told 100 working people to their faces that their morning was worth less than his afternoon. The reeds did not lower. If anything, they leaned in. The gentleman felt the turn. Men like him have a fine sense for a room going cold even as they refuse to learn from it. And he did the thing such men always do when the floor tilts. He doubled. He decided the only error he had made was in not being severe enough. He stepped past me close, so that his shoulder knocked my tray and a bunch of sweet pea went into the gutter, and he set himself directly in front of the king's guard, and he lifted his cane and laid the brass tip of it flat against the polished brass of the breastplate, button to button, metal on royal ground in front of the gate. The crowd made a sound, not a word, a sound the sort an audience makes when a glass starts to tip at the edge of a table. I knew, the way the regiment knows, the way the lane knows, that a man may stand at the rope and shout himself purple at a sentry and nothing will come of it, because a sentry is trained to be shouted at. But a hand laid on the man, or a thing laid on the uniform, on the king's ground, that is another country entirely. That is not rudeness. That is a line, and lines at the Lion's Gate are not kept by temper. They are kept by something older and slower and far more certain than temper, and the gentleman had just walked across one with his eyes shut, the way a confident man steps off a curb he is not troubled to look at. The guard did not flinch. I was nearer than anyone, and I will swear to it on whatever you like. Not a muscle of his face, not the white gloves on the rifle, not the line of the chin strap moved. But somewhere behind the box, somewhere down the inner court where the morning kept its true machinery, something had already begun to move that no telephone call of the gentleman's would ever be able to call back. He just did not know it yet. He thought the silence was surrender. He thought he had won. "There," he said to the crowd, satisfied, lowering the cane at last as if he had proved a point of philosophy. "You see, he knows his place. Now," and he turned the cane on me again, and the brass tip pointed at my chest the way it had pointed at the breastplate. "You, out, take your weeds and your pail and be gone before I have the lot of it tipped in the river. I'll give you to the count of 10, and then I'll move you myself." He had begun to count when the gate behind the king's guard opened. It did not bang open. That is the part people who tell this story afterward always get wrong, because they want it to be a thunderclap, and it was nothing of the kind. The small iron wicket set into the great gilded gate simply swung back on a well-oiled hinge. Quietly, the way a thing opens when the men behind it have decided, without any fuss, that the time for it to open has come. An older man came through. He wore the same red, but it sat on him differently, the way a coat sits differently on the man who has worn out 4 of them. There was gray at his temples under the peak of his cap, for he wore the cap and not the bearskin, and there was a quietness to him that made the young sentry's stillness look, for the first time, like what it was. A thing learned from someone. He had a sergeant's badge and the ribbons of a man who had been somewhere cold and stayed there, and he walked out of the wicket and across the few feet of cobble with no hurry at all, which is the most frightening way a soldier can walk, because it means he has already decided how the next 5 minutes will go and sees no reason to spend himself on the first 30 seconds of them. The gentleman mid-count stopped at 6. "Ah," he said, recovering, and you could see him reach for the register he kept for dealing with subordinates who had at last produced a manager. "Finally, a man with some authority. Now perhaps something can be done. I want this woman removed, and I want this soldier's name because his conduct has been—" "Good morning, sir," the sergeant said. He did not say it the way I say good morning to the post. He said it the way a door closes, gently, fully, and with a click you feel in your chest. And then he did not look at the gentleman at all. He turned to me. "Morning, Meg," he said. "Cold one. You want to keep that shawl pinned." He looked down at the gutter, at the bruised sweet pea lying in the wet, and something in his face did not change at all and was, for that very reason, terrible. "And there's your sweet pea in the road. We'll see to that." "Morning, Sergeant," I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. I had not known he knew my name. I learned later that the post had known it for years, that the men coming on watch were told, the way they were told the names of the streets and the angles of the cameras and the doors that mattered. "That's Meg, she's no trouble, she's been on the corner since before the king was crowned. She sometimes leaves a buttonhole on the box on a man's birthday, and you let her be." I had thought I was tolerated. I had not known I was known. There is a difference, and the difference, that morning, was the whole of everything. The gentleman did not care for being ignored. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I was speaking. I am the one with a complaint here, not this." He flicked the cane at me, but it was a smaller flick than before, because some animal part of him had begun to understand that the temperature of the morning had changed and he had not. "I demand." "You laid your cane on the sentry's plate," the sergeant said. He still was not looking at the gentleman. He had bent, with a small grunt of an old knee, and he had picked the sweet pea up out of the gutter, and he was shaking the water off it gently, the way you would a thing you meant to keep. The crowd had gone very still indeed. That is hardly. On royal ground, in front of the gate. You set metal against the man's uniform." The sergeant straightened, and now at last he looked at the gentleman, and I will tell you that it was not an angry look. I have seen angry looks all my life. I can sell you one for a penny. This was worse for the gentleman than anger, because there was nothing in it he could argue with or shout down or buy off. It was simply the look of a man reading a thing that has already happened and cannot be made not to have happened. "Do you know," the sergeant said, "what that is?" "It is nothing. It was a gesture." The man wouldn't answer me. "He wasn't permitted to answer you," the sergeant said. "That's the post. He stands it so that men like you can stand in front of it and feel important, and he doesn't move, because the day a sentry moves for every loud man at the rope is the day the gate means nothing. You took his silence for stupidity. A great many men do. It's the most expensive mistake a clever man can make." He glanced at the young guard, the smallest glance, and there was 4 winters of something in it. "He's held this post through worse than you on a worse day than this and not blinked. You laid metal on the king's uniform on the king's ground, sir, and the cameras you so dislike have all of it. Every second." I watched the gentleman's eyes go to the railing then, to the phones, to the little dark glass eyes he had been so sure he was the master of, and which had, all this time, been quietly making the only record of the morning that would ever matter. Not the photograph he had wanted, with the gate clean of beggars, but the photograph he was going to get, which was the photograph of a man in a fine gray hat laying his cane on a soldier who would not move, while an old woman bent to save her flowers from the gutter. He had wanted to control how he was seen. It is, I think, the only thing he had ever truly wanted, under the standing and the cane and the count of 10. And he had just lost it completely, in front of everyone forever, and he was only now beginning to feel the shape of the loss. "This is absurd," he said, but the climb had gone out of his voice. "I am a member of 3 of this city's finest institutions. I dine with men who could have you posted to a coal shed at the edge of the kingdom by supper time. Do you understand who I am?" And the sergeant, who had been a soldier for a very long time, and who had clearly been asked that exact question by a great many men who all believed they were the first to think of it, gave the gentleman the one answer there is no reply to. "I do, sir," he said. "You're the man on the cameras. I have turned that line over in my hands 1,000 times since, the way you turn a stone you found on a beach because it was the right weight. You're the man on the cameras. It did not threaten him. It did not insult him. It only told him, very quietly, what he had become in the last 4 minutes. Not a man of standing who had corrected a disorder, but the man in the clip, the one strangers would point at, the one whose name, if his name ever got attached to it, would now mean this and only this. The sergeant did not have to make a single telephone call of his own. He only had to hand the gentleman the truth that the gentleman had built with his own cane. 2 more men had come through the wicket behind the sergeant by then, younger than him, older than the sentry, broad in the way the inner court men are broad. They did not hurry either. They came and stood, one at each of the sergeant's shoulders, and they did not touch the gentleman, and they did not need to. They simply made it plain, by being there, that the morning now had a great deal more weight on the regiment's side of the rope than on his, and that the count of 10 he had been so free with was going to run, in the end, the other way. "I should like to leave," the gentleman said. It came out of him before he could dress it up, and so it was, for the first time all morning, true. "You're not under arrest, sir," the sergeant said mildly. "You're free to go where you like. I'd only ask that you give your name and your particulars to the constable who's coming up the lane now." And there was, indeed, a constable coming up the lane, unhurried, summoned by no fuss I had seen, the way everything that morning came when it was time and not before, so that the matter of the cane against the plate can be looked at properly. That's not for me to decide. That's for them that decide such things. But you'll want it on the record that you gave your name freely rather than had it taken, sir. It reads better, later, to the people you dine with. That, too, I have turned over many times. The sergeant gave the gentleman a way to keep one shred of the standing he had come in with, give the name freely. It reads better. And in doing so he made the gentleman convict himself of the whole of it, because a man who gives his name freely cannot afterward claim he was never there. It was the gentlest trap I ever saw laid, and it was laid by a man picking the water off a bruised sweet pea with 2 fingers. The gentleman gave his name. I will not write it here. He has had enough of his name written in the last year, and besides, I find I do not want his name in a story that is really about the post and the corner and the flowers. He gave his name to the constable and his address, and the names of his 3 fine institutions, which he could not stop himself from listing even then, as if they were a coat he could pull around himself against the cold he had finally noticed. And then he turned to go, and the crowd, which had been so still, did the cruelest and most ordinary thing a crowd does. It did not jeer. It simply opened to let him through, and watched him pass in silence, every dark glass eye following, so that he walked the length of the railing as if down an aisle, the man in the fine gray hat, the man on the cameras, alone. He stopped once. At the corner where the railing meets the lane, he stopped, and for half a breath I thought he would turn and say one more thing, find one more height to stand on. But he had run out of heights. He looked back, not at the crowd, not at the cameras, not even at the gate. He looked back at me, at the bent old woman by the 3 slate flags, the eyesore, the beggar, the thing he had come to have swept away. And I do not know what he saw, but I know what was on his face, because I have a long memory for faces, And what was on his face was the beginning of understanding that he had set out that morning to erase one small old woman from his photograph, and had instead erased himself from his own life. Then he was gone around the corner, and the morning closed over the place where he had been the way water closes over a stone. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant. I did not. I felt mostly the cold in my hip and the loss of a good bunch of sweet pea and a strange grief I could not name, for him, the fool, who would have to go home and be that man in front of the people he loved. But under the grief there was a small warm thing, and the small warm thing was this: I was still on my corner. The eyesore had not been swept up. The fixture was still fixed. And the man who had tried to move me on had moved himself off instead by his own hand. And the post had not had to do anything at all but be exactly, immovably, what it was. The sergeant turned back to me when the gentleman was gone. "You all right, Meg?" "I'm all right, Sergeant." I was not quite, but it was the answer the morning wanted. "He frightened you?" "He did," I admitted, because there was no use lying to a man who picks sweet pea out of gutters. I started to pack up. I was going to take myself off so the lad wouldn't have the bother of me. The sergeant looked at the young guard then, and the young guard, who had not moved through any of it, who was still and would go on being still until his relief came, looked at nothing, the way he had been trained. But I saw, who can read the small weather, I saw the corner of his jaw work. Once, the smallest possible motion. The kind of motion a man makes when he is holding very hard to a stillness that has been asked to carry more than its share that day. And I understood that he had heard every word the gentleman had said about me, and had held his post through all of it, not because he did not care, but because the post was the only way he had to care that the regiment would let him keep. He could not chase the man off. He could not speak for me. He could only stand, immovable, between me and the man who wanted me gone, and let the standing itself be the answer. "That's the one thing you don't do," the sergeant said to me quietly, and he handed me back the rescued sweet pea, the stems shaken, the bloom no worse for the gutter. "You don't pack up for the likes of him, not from this corner. This is the Lion's Gate, Meg. We don't move our own." I did not understand the whole of what he meant until later. I thought he was being kind. He was being kind, but he was also telling me something true about the place that I had stood at for 31 years without ever quite knowing it. I had thought I was at the gate's edge, an old woman they suffered. I learned that morning that I was, in the regiment's slow and unsentimental way of reckoning these things, theirs. A fixture is not a nuisance that has lasted. A fixture is a thing the post has decided to keep, and a thing the post keeps, the post keeps. The constable took his notes. The two broad men went back through the wicket as quietly as they had come. The crowd, having had its scene, broke up into 100 separate mornings again, and the phones came down, and most of those 100 people went off about their day with a thing in their pockets they did not yet know the weight of. And I picked up my pail and set my tray straight on the 3 slate flags, and I sold a buttonhole to a man in a hurry who had seen none of it, and the morning went on, because mornings do. But it was not over. I knew it was not over the moment I saw the first phone lower with that particular care, the care of a person who has just caught something and is checking that they have it. A thing put on those little dark eyes does not die when the moment does. It travels. By that evening it had traveled further than the gentleman, in all his standing, had ever traveled in his life. I do not have one of the telephones that does such things, but the girl who runs the flower stall in the covered market. She buys her cut stems from the same grower I do, and we have known each other 20 years. She came to find me the next morning before I had even laid out my tray, breathless, with her own phone held out in both hands like a thing that might bite. "Meg," she said, "Meg, you're everywhere." I was. Or rather, the morning was the 4 minutes of it, caught from the railing by a dozen hands and stitched together by strangers into a single thing that the whole city, and then more than the city, watched and watched again. There was the gentleman raising his voice. There was the cane pointed at me. There was the bent old woman gathering her flowers to spare the soldier the trouble. There was the cane laid flat on the breastplate, and the crowd's sound, and the small iron wicket swinging quietly open. And there, at the heart of all of it, unmoving through every second, was the young king's guard who would not move for a loud man, and the old sergeant who came out and picked the sweet pea out of the gutter and said, "You're the man on the cameras." People had given it a name. They had put words across the bottom of it. And the words they had chosen were not the gentleman's words, not eyesore, not beggar, not vagrant, but mine, or rather the lane's, the words the workmen had said. "She's been there donkey's years." They had decided, the strangers, all of them, the whole traveling crowd of them, that the story was not about a disorder at the gate that wanted correcting. They had decided it was about an old woman they did not know, whom a powerful man had tried to sweep away, and a soldier who would not let him, and they had taken my side so completely, and so instantly, that I sat down on my own stool in the cold and could not, for a little while, speak. I had spent 31 years being a fixture that most people walked past. And in one morning I had become, to a great many people who would never buy a single flower from me, the old woman from the gate, the one they wouldn't let him move. The chestnut seller 2 gates down had been swept away in a month in the old days in the quiet, when no one was watching and nothing traveled. But the world had eyes now, the little dark glass ones I had so feared, and the eyes, it turned out, could cut both ways. They could land you in rooms you would never see, in front of people who would decide who you were from your worst 10 seconds. Or they could stand 100,000 strangers at your corner, shoulder to shoulder with the workman and the woman whose Nan bought her wedding flowers off you, and dare any man of standing to try to move you now. The gentleman, I am told, learned this faster and more painfully than I did. I did not see it happen, and I am glad I did not, because there is a part of me that has gone soft with age and cannot enjoy even a deserved man's downfall as much as I feel I ought. But the girl from the market kept me informed, gently, over the following weeks, the way you tell an old woman news she will want even when she pretends she does not. The clip found the people the gentleman dined with. Of course it did. He had listed his 3 fine institutions to the constable freely for the record, because it read better, and the record, once it was on the little dark eyes, read itself out to the whole city, and the city carried it to exactly the doors he had been so proud to be admitted through. A man may survive being a fool in private. The institutions a man like that belongs to are not built to survive his being a famous fool in public, and they are very, very good at deciding, quietly and with great regret, that a member who has become the man on the cameras is a member they find they can do without. The first institution wrote to him within the week. The second did not write, it simply did not renew. The third, the finest, the one he had named last and most lovingly, held a meeting. These things are always done in meetings, and concluded that his continued membership was no longer consistent with the standing of the body, which is the politest possible way of telling a man that the standing he thought he possessed had never really been his, but only lent to him by the company he kept, and that the company had looked at the clip and asked for it back. He had told the sergeant, "You do not know who I am," and the trouble in the end was that the city now knew exactly who he was, and who he was the man on the cameras, and there is no surviving that, not for a man whose whole self was a matter of standing. The cane against the plate had cost him the one thing his money could not buy back, which was the agreement of other people to go on pretending he was who he said he was. He had set out to have an old woman moved on from a corner she had earned over 31 years. He had succeeded only in having himself moved on from a place he had thought was his by right, and was not, and never had been, and now never would be again. The matter of the cane on the uniform went, as the sergeant had said, to them that decide such things. I was asked, very courteously, by men in plain clothes with very good manners, to say what I had seen, and I said it plainly, leaving out nothing and adding nothing, because that is the only way an old woman's word is worth anything. The cameras said the rest. There was no fine in the end, or if there was, I never heard of it. The men who decide such things are not in the business of making martyrs out of fools, and a fool who has lost his 3 institutions and his standing and his clean photograph, and the agreement of the city to respect him, has been punished about as thoroughly as the law could ever manage, by his own hand, in 4 minutes, in front of the gate. They let him keep his liberty, which was more than he had been willing to let me keep my corner. I have thought about that too. But all of that is the gentleman's story, and the gentleman, as I said, is not really what this is about. This is about the corner and the post, and what happened after, when the cameras had moved on to the next morning's outrage, and the city had forgotten the man in the gray hat, as a city forgets everything, and the lane settled back into its slow, ordinary turning, and I was, once again, only old Meg with the bad hip and the tray of flowers at the Lion's Gate. Because here is the thing the clip never showed, the thing the strangers in the rooms I will never see never got to put words across the bottom of. A few mornings after it had all gone quiet, I came to my corner in the gray before the city was properly awake, the way I do, to set out before the early commuters came. And the young guard was on the post. Not the sergeant, the young one, the one who had not moved, back on his watch as if nothing had ever happened, because to the post nothing had. The post does not keep score, the post only keeps the gate. He stood at the foot of the Lion's Gate in the full kit, eyes forward, white gloves on the rifle, immovable. And on the corner of the sentry box, on the small flat ledge where the morning light first touches, someone had set a jam jar of water. And in the jam jar, fresh cut, the stems trimmed clean, was a bunch of sweet pea. I had not put it there, I want that understood. I had thought for one foolish warm moment that the regiment had left it for me, and then I understood slowly, the way I understood everything that whole strange season, slowly and all at once, that it was the other way around. It was not for me. It was for the post. Someone, one of the men, I never learned which, and I never asked, because some things you do not ask a guardsman, had gone to the market in the dark before his watch and bought a bunch of the very flour that had gone into the gutter, and had set it where the morning light would find it, in front of the gate, beside the man who would not move. Not as a decoration, as a marker, as a thing said without a word, in the only language the post is allowed to speak. This corner has flowers on it again, and it will go on having flowers on it because we have decided it will, and there is no man of any standing on this earth who is going to move them, or her, off. I stood in the cold gray, and I looked at the jam jar and the sweet pea and the young man who would not look back at me, and I did the only thing I could think to do, which was the thing I had done every morning for 31 years, and would go on doing for whatever mornings I have left. I said low, not expecting an answer, only wanting the man inside the stillness to know that someone had marked him kindly. "Morning, son, cold one. Mind you keep warm." And the young king's guard, who is not permitted to speak, who held his whole post through a morning of being told to sweep me away and did not move a muscle of his face, looked at nothing, the way he was trained, and the corner of his jaw worked once, the smallest possible motion, the kind a man makes when he is holding very hard to a stillness that is carrying more than its share, which is, from a man who is not allowed to answer you, the loudest possible good morning back. I sold flowers at the Lion's Gate for 9 more years after the morning of the gentleman and his cane. My hip got worse, and my eyes got worse, and the slope of my back got worse, and the regiment, in its slow, unsentimental way, got better and better at making sure none of it mattered. The men coming on watch were told my name and told to let me be. They had always been told that, I learned, but now there was something underneath it that had not been there before, a thing the morning of the cane had set, that I never heard said aloud and felt every single day. When the winter was hard, a hot mug appeared on the ledge of the box, left where I would find it and never spoken of. When the railing was repainted and the contractors wanted the corner cleared, a word went somewhere, and the corner was not cleared, and the contractors painted around the 3 slate flags and the old woman on them as though we were part of the ironwork, which, I had come to understand, we were. And every so often, not often, but enough, on a morning when the light came up clean over the gate, there would be a jam jar of sweet pea on the ledge of the sentry box that I had not put there. I never caught the man who did it. I think it was a different man each time. I think it became, the way these things do in a regiment, a thing that was simply done, handed down from watch to watch, the way the names of the streets are handed down, the way my own name was handed down. That's Meg, she's no trouble, she's been on the corner since before the king was crowned, and once a great fool tried to have her moved on and lost his own place instead, and we keep flowers on the box for her, and you let her be. You let her be. It is the whole of the regiment's love, that phrase, and it is enough, and it is more than most people get, and I had it for 9 years over and above the 31 I had spent earning it without knowing I was earning anything. I am not at the gate now. The hip won that fight in the end, as hips do, and I sell no flowers anymore, and the 3 slate flags at the corner of the railing belong to a younger woman now, a refugee from somewhere far and cold, who came to the corner shy and frightened that she would be moved on, and who was told by an old sergeant with gray at his temples on her first morning, "This is the Lion's Gate. We don't move our own. You'll do." I gave her my pail. I told her the names of the flowers and the angles of the light, and the trick of pinning a shawl against the gate's particular wind. And I told her, last of all, the thing that took me 31 years and 1 bad morning to learn, and that I did not want her to have to learn the slow way. I told her she was not at the edge of the gate suffered. I told her she was a fixture which is not a nuisance that has lasted, but a thing the post has decided to keep. I told her that there would be men now and then, men of standing with fine hats and quick canes, who would look at her and see litter blown against a beautiful gate and decide that someone in a red coat ought to sweep her up. And I told her not to pack up for them, not from this corner, not ever. Because the man in the red coat will not move. That is the whole of it in the end, the thing I learned at the Lion's Gate that I would give to anyone who would take it. The world is full of loud men who believe that pointing settles a thing, and most mornings, in most places, they are right, and the bent and the old and the frightened are swept up and moved on into rooms no one is watching. But there are corners in this world that are kept not by temper, not by argument, not by money, but by something older and slower and far more certain, that stands at the foot of the gate in the cold with its eyes forward and its white gloves on its rifle, and will not, for any standing on earth, be moved. And when you have the luck to find one of those corners, and to be taken into the keeping of it, then you may be old and bent and poor and afraid, and a great man may point his cane at you and give you to the count of 10, and you may stand exactly where you are, because the man behind you in the red coat has already decided without a word that this is the line, and the line will hold. He held it for me. I never learned his name, and I find I do not need to. He is every young man who has ever taken that post and stood through a loud morning without moving, carrying more than his share of a stillness that is really a kind of love held under so much discipline that you would mistake it for a statue if you did not know how to read the small weather of a guardsman's face. I knew how to read it. I read it for 40 years, and the truest thing it ever said to me, it said on the coldest morning, with a fool's cane on its plate and an old woman's flowers in the gutter, and it said it without moving a muscle, and it said, "Not her, not from this corner, she stays." And I stayed.